There's a very simple formulation in traditional Buddhism about craving, that craving is a problem, that craving is the problem. It's the wanting. And so we're taught in a high school world cultures course, we're taught in an intro to religions class that the problem of Buddhism is desire, and that the way out of suffering is the way out of desire. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this craving. The term is tanha, Tanha is how it's written. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. And tanha is a craving, but it's a craving that has its own kind of will, you know. We don't choose craving. We don't choose to want this or that. We don't choose to want ice cream. We choose ice cream, but we don't choose to want ice cream, right? It has this quality that goes beyond our own volition. So we can start this by thinking about what we crave. What we crave is what we keep bringing to the front of our mind. Sometimes that's something like ice cream, right? Because it comes from an actual appetite. Or maybe something like alcohol. We develop a feel for what that thing is over there, and we can feel the magnetic pull of it. And whether we're consciously thinking about it all the time or not, it takes up a certain amount of real estate in the mind. But we also crave certain thoughts. We don't mean to. We might have a memory that we can't let go of. We chew on it all the time. There's something about the taste of it that we like. Even if it's bitter, we crave it. And so we bring it back and bring it back and bring it back. Or a fantasy about who we could be, who we might become. And so we think about that. It finds its way in, it sneaks back when we least expect it. And when it arrives, it's more interesting than the other things. It's more compelling. All of these things fall under this broad category of tanha, craving. It's the literal definition is a thirst. We're thirsty for these things, and nothing ever really quenches this thirst, because if we got enough of the thing, we would just take a break. You know, if we got enough ice cream, fine, but tomorrow we want it again. And if you've ever sat zazen, but in particular if you've ever sat sesshin, where you sit for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days, you can get a taste of how this works. Because what comes to our mind as we sit is craving. Again, not necessarily in the form of wanting, where we would say, I want this, but in the form of these thoughts that are too tasty for us to put down. So they arise and arise and arise. And you might find, if you're sitting for 3, 4, 5 days, that maybe on the 4th day, you actually exhaust a thought. You've taken a fantasy as far as that fantasy can go, and for a moment you feel that fantasy fall away. That's wonderful. There's this very liberating feeling, and we talk about falling away a lot in this tradition because that experience is so familiar. But if you stick around long enough, you pick up a new one. You pick up a new taste, a new thing to chew on. Craving just doesn't go away on its own. So in the foundational teachings, there's a response to tanha. It's called chanda. And chanda is a kind of wholesome craving. It's a wholesome desire. It's the wholesome desire specifically to practice, usually described as the desire to meditate, but it could be the desire to practice in the other ways that we practice. It's that pull. And the idea of the relationship between tanha and chanda is that we transform tanha. We transform this thirst and we turn it into the wholesome desire. We take that energy, that obsessive energy, and we channel it into spiritual practice. It's a beautiful idea. And it's a universal idea, I think, among spiritual traditions, so that almost anyone who comes to a spiritual tradition is seeking something like this. At some point, we think to ourselves, there are parts of myself, there are parts of my mind, there are parts of my experience that I would prefer not be so front and center. And there's another way of being that not only would I like to embody, but I'd like to want it, so that I'm not just putting it on. It's really coming from someplace profound. So when we hear this idea that we can take the part we don't want and we can reverse the energy so that it goes in the opposite direction, into that positive direction, that wholesome direction, we think, yes, that is for me. And what I wanted to bring up tonight is that as beautiful as that idea is, it's a very rare thing for it to work. This is why across centuries and across spiritual traditions, across cultures, celibacy as a spiritual practice has largely been a failure, a dangerous failure. Because it's a binary. The whole thing rests on the dualism that we can reject one thing for another thing. And so someone who comes to that practice full of sexual desire as a normal human being might, and then tries to transform that desire into something else, is not just embracing something else, they're rejecting that original desire. And if they take up that practice long enough, they pretend to others and to themselves that that desire is no longer driving them. It's no longer real. It no longer has any power behind it. But it's there. That desire is still that desire. And now it's just coexisting with this other desire, this other drive. Except the person taking up that practice is looking at one of them and trying really hard not to look at the other. And so there's an option C. That option C isn't unique to Zen, but I think that Zen has a particular interest in it, which is that rather than give in to craving, and rather than trying to transform one craving into a different kind of craving, we simply allow for the craving. We allow it to be there. So that if we really, really want ice cream, but we really don't think we should be eating ice cream, we learn to walk past the ice cream store fully wanting ice cream, making space for that at the table, not pretending it's not there, not pretending that it doesn't have power in our minds, but not necessarily giving it power in our actions. Chanda, I read a wonderful thing about it today, describing chanda as a psychological yes. Because whereas tanha, whereas craving is not a choice, chanda is. Right? It's choosing something in particular. This option C, and I don't know if there's a great name for option C, the option C is simply to choose to let the thing be there in the first place. That can be the choice to allow for the craving for a thing. It can be that thirst for a drink. It can be space for an obsessive thought, for a regret, for a fantasy, for a hope. And it can be making space for tanha itself. Looking at who you are, at where you are, at the way that you're moving in the world, and recognizing craving is present, thirst is present. Not as a problem, but as a kind of passenger. And in this way, we don't embrace and we don't reject. We just accept. Zazen is so well suited to this set of questions because, again, we're confronted constantly with thirst. And no matter who you are, no matter how you were taught or by whom, at some point in this practice, you will sit in this posture and a thought will come into your mind, whether it's a desire or just something you can't put down, and you will try to push it out. You will try to show it the door. And if you're like most people, you won't give up after one time. You'll do this hundreds of times. And when that doesn't work, you'll try to replace it with something that you should be thinking about. Right? You'll fish around in your mind for what chanda might be in this moment. And when you find yourself thinking about how angry you are at that person who cut you off in traffic this morning and all the horrible things you're thinking about them and how you just can't let that go, you'll start thinking, no, 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 no. I love all beings. And you'll try to fill yourself with compassion so full that there's no space for this other thought. And if you're like me, it will feel pretty good because it feels better, because it feels like you're making a choice that matters. But when your energy for that turns down at all, what you'll see immediately is that other thought that was always there, because we don't know how to push it out. This is a practice. This option C is a practice for when we sit, but it's a practice for everything. It's a practice for every moment. And it isn't just a practice for the things that we want or don't want in our own minds. Zen is not a practice of rejecting the qualities that we don't want. And Zen is also not a practice of fabricating a version of ourselves that we would like better. In the same way, it's not a practice of rejecting the world or accepting the world. In one way or the other. It's just simply allowing all of it. So we walk down the street with this practice in hand, and we allow ourselves, in all of our complexity, in all of our disappointing aspects, and all of our noblest intentions, to go from point A to point B. And along the way, we see the things that we wish weren't there, and we see the things that we like better. And we allow for all of them to be there as well. So this too is a yes. But it's a yes that stays here with no pushing and no pulling. And this is the only thing we've ever really talked about. It's just that today I threw in some Pali terms. And that's where I'll stop.